Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video HVI podcast. And today I'm joined by Professors Alan Avery-Peck and Bruce Chilton. And today we're going to continue where we left off from last time on their book Targums and Rabbinic Literature. So first off, I just want to say real quick, thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Jacob.
One thing I'd like to ask before I get to the new questions I have for you both. For those that missed the previous part, could you both briefly describe what the Targums are for those that have no idea what the Targum is?
The word Targum by itself conveys something of its subject matter because it is an Aramaic word. And it's an Aramaic word that simply means translation. However, the term in Aramaic translation was applied to highly interpretative renderings of the biblical books, which were used at first in the context of synagogue worship in the early centuries of the Common Era. And then by the time of the Rabbinic period, came to be the focus of discussion among experts. So that a bit like Latin used to be a popular language of Christianity and then became an elite language, so the Targumim began as a popular literature and then became more and more the subject of expert speculation. The result is you have a very long developing corpus of literature of better than 1,000 years, so that it becomes important to be able to assign the place and, insofar as you can, the date of a given Targum in order to understand what it represents. The challenge in kind is not different from what we confront when dealing with rabbinic literature as a whole, but because critical attention has turned to the Targumim only fairly recently, the latter part of the 20th century represented time to catch up within that field.
Yeah, I would actually just add a question for Bruce to maybe clarify this. So we often hear the word the Targum or the concept the Targum, and we think of a particular translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, but there is no such thing as the Targum. There's 1,000 years of different people in different settings translating different parts of the Bible into Aramaic, and so there are Targumim in plural or Targums. Do I have that right?
Yes, that is exactly the case. And sometimes it's because of the turns of phrase in rabbinic literature that can lead to a misimpression. For example, Joseph Barchia of Pumbedita is quoted as saying, "If I didn't know the Targum of this verse, I wouldn't know what it meant." But he's only saying, if I didn't know the translation of this verse, I would not know what it meant. But that led to the misimpression that there was a single cohesive Targum, which if you master, you will know exactly how the Bible was understood in the time of Jesus. And that just is not the case. Rather, it's just as you say, because the Targum started as an oral literature, the concept was that you had to memorize this in order to provide the rendering in a synagogue. The tradition began as ad hoc renderings of passages, which only grew into the rendering of a whole document over time, and then were aggregated, but in different times and different places. So it's important to know just where that gathering took place and how a particular Targum emerged. Yeah, thank you, Alan. That's a very good clarifying question.
So, Alan, can you tell us about Mishnah Gittin 9:10 on divorce?
So we had, in thinking about what we might do with you today, Jacob, and with your listeners, thought of reflecting on specific passages. This book that we're talking about, Targums and Rabbinic Literature, explains each of the Targumic texts, as Bruce just let them out, and also all of the rabbinic texts that have a relevance to the understanding of the New Testament. So the book is comprised of many, many chapters, each dealing with one document. And in each chapter, there is a section which says, here is a text in this document that is relevant to the understanding of the New Testament, or the relevance might be the New Testament in its historical setting, or in some cases, it's the New Testament which informs the later document. So in preparing to speak with you today, Jacob, Bruce, and I thought of a couple passages that might be interesting for your listeners. And I picked one which I think is a real obvious reflection of the way in which teachings of Jesus, or particular legal views of Jesus, rather than being just out someplace, in the stratosphere, Jesus thought this, and no one else had such an idea. How could he possibly have imagined? So we have a case here in which a passage in the Mishnah exactly parallels the topic that is debated between Jesus and Jewish authorities of his day, the Pharisees in this case, in the book of Matthew. Maybe I'll begin with Matthew 19, beginning in verse 3, reading in the Revised Standard, actually the New Revised Standard Version's translation. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, to test him. And they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Jesus answered, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And that for this reason, this is quoting, of course, from the book of Genesis, a man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her? Right? Biblical law says divorce is permissible and sets out terms for divorce. And Jesus seems to be contradicting biblical Hebrew Bible and then later Jewish practice. He said it was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. So here we have this very famous passage which anyone reading the New Testament on its own would have a sense of Jesus as standing outside of, or rejecting, or calling upon a higher law than what the Jews of his own day considered to be normative and what they practiced. And indeed, in some ways, rejecting even Mosaic law. So so the passage that I'm referring to, which for those of you who have our book in front of you, is on page 243. I'm sure you have one on your desk, one in your glove compartment, that you're prepared for this. In a section of the Mishnah, there's a whole section on divorce, called Mishnah Masechet Gitin, Gitin being the word for divorces in Aramaic or Hebrew, a get being a document of divorce. And you have a dispute between two different groups of scholars who lived while the temple still stood, so possibly later than Jesus's own lifetime, but very close to that time in the first centuries. And both of these authorities, both the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, agree that divorce is permissible, but they set different limits on divorce. The passage reads, the house of Shammai say a man may divorce his wife only because he has found grounds for it in unchastity. And the house of Shammai based that on the verse in Deuteronomy 24:1, which says you can divorce because you have found in her something indecent. And the house of Hillel respond, no, he can divorce her for any reason whatsoever, even if she simply wrecked his dinner. Since it says the same thing, any matter of indecency. Now, the striking thing, if we sit down and look at this, is to note that Jesus's position is not that divorce is impermissible. Jesus says divorce is impermissible except in the case of unchastity, which is exactly what Deuteronomy 24:1 says, and exactly what the house of Shammai say. A man may divorce his wife only because he has found grounds for it in unchastity. So here's a case in which attention to the legal milieu in which Jesus exists. And I'm not saying that he knew the opinions of the house of Hillel and Shammai or that they knew his view on this, but certainly he approaches the Pharisees and there's a debate about this. And it turns out that the position that Jesus takes, rather than being an outlier or a case in which Jesus is calling upon a higher and better law than the Jewish people, of whom, of course, he was a part, he actually participates in a debate that might well have been current in his own day. And in this regard, I mean, one of the interesting things is, of course, Jesus depends, he says, he may only divorce her for reasons of unchastity because it says in Genesis, they shall become as one flesh, which doesn't actually respond to the issue. Jesus would have done better in this case by reading the Mishnah if it had existed when he was alive and noting the verse of Deuteronomy 24:1, because he found in her, the Hebrew word erva, some sort of sexual impropriety. So this is the sort of way in which scholars for many years on passages like this one, Bruce and I didn't discover this, as a great, marvelous thing. But throughout our book, there are many, many cases of much more subtle connections and subtle ways in which we find Jesus himself in his teachings or the New Testament writers to be, rather than standing alone and, however later Christian writers phrased it, rejecting Judaism. Actually, in the case at hand, number one, Jesus has a conversation with Pharisees. You mostly have conversations with people you have some sort of respect for and are willing to interact with and listen to. And in this discussion, he takes a view which I assume many of the Pharisees would have said, yeah, we got it. We even agree. So that was this first example that I thought of bringing.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Alan. Can I add a comment?
I hope you will.
One about the book, and the comment has to do at two levels. At the one level, just as you're saying, your explanation provides a nuanced assessment of when the Mishnah was produced and how we could use a document, although of a later period, to understand the context of the first century. So that requires some reflection on when each document comes from. And that is part of the purpose of the book, to get straight in our minds when Targumic and Rabbinic literature emerge, document by document. This is what puts our work in a different category from one which some of our listeners might know or might have heard of, namely the Compendium of Strauch-Billerbeck, which in fact cites this very case. The difference is it cites this very case in a way that does not permit you to understand when a given statement is being made in terms of time. And therefore, comparison becomes difficult. And the other comment is, just as we need nuance at the level of rabbinic literature and Targumim, so also at the level of the New Testament. Since Mark manages to give us a version of this interaction with the Pharisees, which doesn't include the exception clause for indecency. In other words, Jesus' own position was differently remembered among the various positions that were possible in the first century. So I think all of that enriches our contextual understanding on both sides, on the sides of Rabbinica and on the side of the New Testament.
Yeah, I would note in that regard, and this particular passage of the Mishnah Gittin, turns out to be really interesting for this, because after the houses debate and dispute, and we assume the houses lived while the temple stood, Rabbi Akiba,
Yeah.
who lives 100 years later during the period of the Bar Kokhba War, right? So in around 135 to 140, in this period, Akiba exists, and he continues the discussion and says he can divorce his wife. And I'm sorry for those. We're not reflecting here on the chauvinism of these passages. That could be a whole nother topic, Jacob. But right, Akiba says even if he found someone prettier, he can divorce her. Now, I'm less interested in the content of his statement, which is not a statement that I wish to stand behind,
Right.
but in the fact that Akiba, from the hundreds and beyond, 130, 140, is put in conversation with other authorities who lived 60, 70, 80 years before. So the question of how close this passage is in its content to the period of Jesus, and then, as Bruce, as you pointed out, even the recollection of what Jesus said, which means, did he say it or did someone imagine he said it? So we face significant critical issues, and which again leads us, I think Bruce and I would agree to say that one of the strengths of our approach here is generally not to say Jesus was talking to these guys, or he had read the Mishnah, or they had read the New Testament. What we are trying to do is to develop a sense of the thought world in which these different representations of Jewish law and ideology existed.
Right. In fact, in this regard, sorry not to prolong the discussion of Mishnah, Jacob.
Oh no,
I can't resist.
fine.
In this regard, Alan, I've sometimes wondered and wonder about your opinion, because elsewhere in the Mishnah, Akiba, for all of his learning, is severely criticized, in particular for his support of Bar Kokhba, who became known as Bar Kokhba. Is the attribution of this opinion to him here a part of that critical strand?
Oh boy, now you've got me. We'll have to do. I don't. The criticism of Akiba. He's the only rabbi who's known to have declared that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And the response, though only recorded in later texts, is the rabbis respond to him, Akiba, grass will grow from your cheek, and the Messiah will not yet have come. Now, that, of course, itself is a rabbinic ideology that we don't expect the Messiah, we're waiting for the Messiah, which emerges exactly when. Certainly there is a messianic hope. But whether or not that same level of critique or concern about Akiba's ideologies is expressed any specific ways in the Mishnah, I'm not clear. I don't think anyone has identified that as an aspect of Akiba's place in the Mishnah, and he certainly is one of the most important rabbis of the Mishnah. So maybe a year from now we'll have a new book on that topic. It's an interesting.
Exactly. It's just that because the way in which the differing positions are scaled, there's a sense in which his view is in continuity with the other, and yet it is a fairly profound leap. So I just wondered whether that was a part of it.
Well, of course, the Hillelite view, which is usually taken to be normative, at least by Talmudic times, is he can divorce her even if she spoiled his dish. So in some ways, Akiba's next step, anything. He doesn't, he's essentially saying, especially since beauty is in the eyes of the beholder,
right?
What Akiba is saying is there is no limit to the man's right to divorce. He really doesn't need a reason. He can claim almost anything.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it bears noting for our listeners that despite this, chauvinistic or socially dangerous statement, a man can divorce a wife for anyone, we know from elsewhere in the Mishnaic literature and in the marriage contract itself that there are financial obligations to be
Right.
paid upon divorce. And so the idea you can divorce like that and for any reason, of course, wasn't the reality. And the rabbis themselves tell stories of rabbis
Mm-hmm.
who were in unhappy marriages and couldn't divorce because they couldn't come up with the amount of money that they had to pay
Right.
as part of the divorce settlement. So even one of the things we need to be
Mm-hmm.
careful about, and I think is a problem, especially when we come from the world of New Testaments or other ancient literatures, and we look at a passage like this and say, oh, those rabbis were chauvinistic, didn't care about women,
Mm-hmm.
belittled women, until this passage certainly would reflect that, but until you know the entire picture
Mm-hmm.
of
Exactly.
how rabbinic law works, you have to be very careful not to draw conclusions based on limited
Limited.
passages in a literature that just extends forever.
Is vast, yeah. And then from time to time, historical evidence from outside rabbinic literature makes us realize that we could draw conclusions hastily by imagining that whatever the rabbis said went instantaneously, because within Talmud, there's a discussion of what you do when your opinion, although pristine, is in fact not accepted. And in this particular instance, we know of several cases from the Herodian household, the family of Herod the Great, of women within that dynasty, in fact, divorcing their husbands.
Yeah.
Now, Josephus, probably reflecting opinions like Shammai's and Hillel, says, oh, that's against Jewish law. But we nonetheless have the example of them doing it. And we also have ancient materials from Elephantine in Egypt, in which women actually write out decrees of divorce. So, not all Judaism of the Second Temple or later was Rabbinic Judaism. We have a very important strand of developing thought here, but it is not the only one, and only with caution should it be read as reflecting historical circumstances.
Which is why scholars increasingly understand the New Testament as one of the earliest sources for Jewish law in the first century, not simply for challenging or contradicting, but
Mhm.
actually representing.
So, Jacob,
All
you
right,
can see
so
why we
Bruce,
get interested in these cases.
yeah, I do. All right, so now, Bruce, I'm going to ask you something that you
Sure.
brought up to me. Is Leviticus 22:28 and Pseudo Jonathan and Luke 6:36?
Yeah, this is an interesting case, one that was brought to my attention. One reason I like to go back to it is that I ran across it in my reading of an older work by Matthew Black called An Aramaic Approach to the Gospels and Acts. And I think it demonstrates both his acuity in citing examples and also how we need to move beyond some of his analysis to understand his examples. And he was struck by a passage that comes in the book of Leviticus 22:28, which speaks of not killing an animal and her young on the same day. And there's an extension of that verse in the Targum Pseudo Jonathan that says, my people, children of Israel, since our Father is merciful in heaven, so should you be merciful upon the earth. Now, those familiar with Luke's version of what we usually call the Sermon on the Mount, which in Luke is actually Sermon on the Plain, will see that this represents very closely the words attributed to Jesus there. Become merciful, just as your Father is also merciful. By the way, that's not Matthew's version, which is not merciful, but perfect. So Matthew Black observed, oh, there you are. It must be that the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan is a very early source, and that Jesus is citing a version of that statement, for which there are several problems. I mean, one is that the task in Luke 6 is really quite apart from what's going on in Leviticus 22. And more importantly, the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, because it actually refers to the wife of Muhammad, clearly is quite a late source. It's one of the examples of a Targum from the Byzantine period. And over time, it's become increasingly obvious also that its language stems from that period, not before the 7th century of the Common Era. So that means that you're left with a bit of a puzzle. Then why should there be this correspondence if one really can't? It's not as in the position we just had of Mishnah Gittin, where it's at least just referring to Hillel and Shammai from an earlier period. You have no such reference within the Targum. So it appears to be implausible to argue that somehow Jesus is citing the Targum. But likewise, it seems wildly unlikely that the Targum is citing the Gospel according to Luke or anything like the Gospel according to Luke. Seems rather to be the case that we're dealing with an example of what I would call proverbial expression. And because it is proverbial, it can readily be absorbed within very different contexts. And I would suggest that this is exactly what has occurred here. What it suggests to us is that you have a tendency within folk wisdom, within the oral culture of the oral early centuries of the Common Era, which is reflected differently in the New Testament on the one hand, and some of the Targumim on the other hand. So, to me, the finding which is appropriate is that to discover these intersections does not in the least by itself imply a causal relationship. If we discuss further, there are some passages where I suggest one can speak of a causal relationship, one body of literature to another, but the mere fact of intersection by itself doesn't establish that. If the contexts are radically different, then the argument for a direct borrowing is seriously weakened. At the same time, it also would suggest, hand in hand with what Alan was just saying about the Mishnah Gittin, just as Jesus talking about divorce is not aberrant in the context of early Judaism, so his talking about being merciful does not, in fact, set him apart from Targumic or Rabbinic Judaism. In one sense, you might think that it is painful to have to say that. On the other hand, the simple fact of the matter is that there is a persistent tendency to assume that we can better understand Jesus by portraying him in an antagonistic relationship with Judaism. But these are cases in which we can see him actually absorbing the culture of his time, either the culture regarding the ethics of divorce, obviously very important, or the culture understanding God's mercy within an interpretative tradition.
You know, Bruce, you're setting this out as the use of a common saying in different contexts. I mean, is so interesting, of course, because the context in Leviticus don't slaughter an animal and its young on the same day. The context in Luke, be kind to your enemies, are totally different occasions for mercy, and yet they both yield the opportunity to express the same idea. You should be merciful.
Exactly.
So that, but the other part of where you sort of concluded this was this question of how we are overall to understand Jesus. And, to unfortunately recall the not too long ago, including when I was an undergraduate student, when the idea was that the authentic Jesus was the Jesus who in the New Testament was least likely to be like the Jews. How do you know what's authentic? Well, when he said something that Jews wouldn't say. Whereas today, to the contrary, we would argue that the authentic Jesus is the Jesus who says stuff that someone later on wouldn't have made up, right? When Jesus says, follow the law, no later Christian was going to make that up. When Jesus says, you must tithe dill, mint, and cumin, even as you do the weightier matters, no one was going to make that up. So we've really, in the last century, maybe less than a century, seen a reversal in our understanding of who Jesus was. And of course, it's so important because as doesn't take a whole lot of deep thinking to recognize that someone who was born within a family that observed a certain religious tradition, who grew up in that religious tradition, who preached exclusively to members of that religious tradition in their houses of worship, whatever the edges there might be, the ways in which that preacher has his or her own particular take on things, there's little likely that he or she was going to entirely demean or reject or stand outside of that inherited tradition, which was part of who they were.
For exactly that reason, Alan, it is, in my opinion, regrettable that scholars still, in the study of Jesus and the development of the New Testament, continue to use what they call the criterion. They use the word criterion because it's supposed to be a guiding principle of critical study. The criterion of dissimilarity, which when you say it just sounds like a antiseptic methodological phrase. What they in fact mean, and this is actually spelled out by Norman Perrin in his book, Rediscovering the Historical Jesus, and cited many, many times since and to our day. What it in fact means is that if a statement is attributed to Jesus and actually reflects the ethos of Judaism, it is less likely to be authentic. And that, despite my best efforts and the efforts of others, became still the operating principle of the still fairly well-known Jesus Seminar. And of course, if that's the criterion that you employ, and then you add to that what is called the criterion of double dissimilarity. All right, let's back up and understand that. Dissimilarity is if it's Jewish-like, it's not authentic. And also, if it's church-like, it's not authentic. Well, if you eliminate that matter from your scrutiny as being an evidential basis of understanding Jesus, what do you have left except a Hellenistic, rather liberal-looking Jesus? And by golly, that's exactly what the Jesus Seminar gave to us. But it does so by what, in my opinion, is a form of methodological sleight of hand. That is, instead of considering evidence, you reject certain kinds of evidence from the very beginning. And one of the points of the book that Alan and I have worked on with our collaborators, because I think I speak for myself anyway, saying I could not personally have dated all of the Targumim at the beginning of this project. Couldn't have dated them all individually. For this, we really did need expert collaborators, and we got them. But one of the reasons for our going through the exercise is simply to say we have these intersections present. We're not saying that each of them has a demonstrable link that's causal between Jesus and Rabbinic Judaism. In fact, we give good evidence to be cautious about that claim. But there are nonetheless intersections with the New Testament, which is a part of what any scholar seriously interested in our sources should engage in.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to some. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to add, and part of this also, emerges out of a certainty that the value and purpose of Jesus's teachings couldn't be commensurate with what the Jews believed and held. So it is ultimately a kind of anti-Judaism, which exists throughout the later New Testament writings as well, and that needs to be continually fought even today, right? The idea that Jesus wasn't part of the community into which he was born. They were Jews. Go ahead, Jacob.
So here's a question that I have for both of you: is when you look at the Targumim, how do you tell? How does it work? How do you tell which text, which parts of it go back before Jesus' time, if any of it does, if then way after his time? How does that work?
Well, in the case of the Targumim, we have the happy circumstance that just as in the New Testament itself, there is criticism of those who run the temple aimed at them on the supposition that the temple is still functioning as a sacrificial center. So this becomes a basis for considering certain earlier parts of the Targumim, especially in the Targum called Jonathan, that is Jonathan to the prophets, where we appear to have a case where some of the controversy concerning how the temple should be run, which during the first century was quite deep, is reflected in Targumic literature, much as it is reflected in the New Testament, and in particular, because the priests were in charge, the priests are sometimes the butt of this opposition within the Targumim. So, because we have this epic event, namely the destruction of the temple, which is a watershed in the entire unfolding in rabbinic literature, when we can discern within Targumim a difference between the before and the after. The before, when there's strife about worship in the temple and how it should be conducted, and the after being the supposition that in fact the worship that used to be in the temple is now in heaven. That is a major difference. And you can trace that difference through the earlier Targumim. So when you have an institution as important as the temple being destroyed during the period of the formation of a literature, then how that literature relates to the temple is an index of how the literature grew. By the way, this is also the case in the New Testament, because sometimes the New Testament reflects a perspective according to which the temple is done and there's nothing left except in heaven. Think the Epistle to the Hebrews. Think the Revelation to John. And other cases, all of the Gospels, when Jesus is placed in the temple in a dispute, remarkably like disputes about the temple, reflected in the Targumim. So, as I was saying earlier, by being sensitive to the way in which all of our literatures, on the New Testament side and the rabbinic side, refer to their contexts, we can see that these are documents that grew over time and need to be understood as such in order for them to be evaluated at all.
I must say, and I don't know how you find things at Bard, Bruce, but my students at the College of Holy Cross, very, very smart and capable students, but conceiving, whether it's of the Hebrew Bible or of the New Testament, not as something that someone sat down and wrote, whether God or not, but that all reflects a certain singular perspective, is a very, very hard thing. They get to be, they're adults, not had the experience of reading these literatures as the products of literary and theological and ideational accretion, that you really have to be sometimes within the same verse. Think about the part that was earlier and the part that someone chose to add. So this is such an important point for anyone who's interested in these ancient literatures.
Yeah, exactly so. I'm just finished earlier this afternoon correcting my second batch of papers for the semester. And yes, this becomes very clear. And what you can see is there are some students who take to this understanding more readily. And in other cases, as Americans, we really have quite a deep cultural bias towards what we may quote the Bible says, as if the Bible were a unitary document. And yet, the biblical authors, in fact, refer to earlier materials in a way that shows they were aware this was a developing tradition. And so, my argument with the students is, taken in its own terms, this is how this collection of documents we call the Bible intends to be read.
Yep.
So now I want to ask about the Sifri numbers 25-2 on burying the dead.
So here's another kind of a case, in this case taken from a document of Midrash that is of scriptural interpretation, that cites authorities, rabbis from around the same period as we saw in the Mishnah, although the exact dating of Sifrei, which is in this case, commentary on the Book of Numbers, is not entirely clear. But the starting point from this is Jesus' statement at Luke, not in Sifrei, but for our interest in this, is Jesus' statement in Luke chapter 9, who says, if you want to follow me, you must leave unburied even your father. Right? The crucial expectation of the imminent onset of God's kingdom means that nothing should or can come between you and your adherence to me as the nexus through which that kingdom will emerge. Even to the extent, as I assume Jesus used this as an expression or as an idea, kind of unlikely, in fact, that, Jesus says, come follow me, and you were about to bury a parent, God forbid. But to the extent that this is what you would be obligated to do. Now, the rabbis in the same century anyway, negotiate the statement in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, that someone who's taken a Levirate vow, right? So someone who is going to be a Nazir and refuse, a Nazirite vow, I meant to say, and refuse wine, refuse to cut his hair, refuse contact with the dead. What's the obligations upon that person who's taken this vow of extreme holiness? And interestingly, the passage in the Sifrei that we're talking about comes to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, such a Nazir would need to not bury his parent, if, God forbid, that was the case. But that if there were a body, a corpse, that required burial and that there was no one else to bury it, then the burial of the dead would overcome his Nazirite vow. Right? You would make yourself, you would stop and do that and forget about everything else. So here's a case in which, at least on the surface, we have a seeming tension between Jesus, who makes no accommodation for the need to bury the dead, and the rabbinic literature of his or a slightly later period, which says that, in fact, the obligation to bury the dead overcomes all other religious obligations, even those of a person who has taken a vow not to have contact with the dead. Now, and I'm actually interested in how Bruce would look at this in the context of early Judaism and Christianity as well. But to me, even in a case here where we see an option of saying, you see, Jesus saw something as more important and there's a disagreement, in some ways, what Jesus meant to argue by his statement, and whether its shock value was the main thing, or whether he was making the point that a religious obligation is the most important thing you can fulfill. Being part of the kingdom of heaven is the most important thing you fulfill. That overcomes everything. For the rabbis, who were not, they weren't looking at this, bury this person or be part of the kingdom of heaven. Right? Those weren't the options for them. For them, the option was observe a vow of holiness, but leave this poor person buried, something more unthinkable than which I can't imagine. And they said, no, you do the right thing. The right thing comes first. So I think the dispute here, which on the surface pits Judaism in its legal position, at least as expressed by the rabbis, and we don't know what other Jews, as we've been pointing out, would say, but which pits Jesus against this, it's perhaps the case that both are engaged in the same sort of activity, figuring out what's really important. And the difference between Jesus's position on many legal matters like this is not a disagreement with the theory that's expressed in other rabbinic literature, which is doing what is ethical, doing what is good, doing what is right, but the unique circumstance of the belief that the kingdom is upon us. And it's really that which changes everything. So again, I think this is a good example of a way in which the literatures we're looking at help us to get a broader sense of the thought world, the theological world, the world of what the concerns were as between Jesus and other Jews. Not so much a question of he thought X and they thought the opposite of X, but how did they account for what the law and what correct practice should be, given their larger perspective on matters.
Yes, in the clash of principles, which one do you follow? The Nazirite principle or the duty of burial? It's interesting, since the practices associated with the Nazirite vow are also in the background of Christianity. Not, I would say, of Jesus personally, but of his movement after his death. In particular, his brother, James, was known for his practice in Jerusalem of the Nazirite vow. So the issues that are actually raised within this passage of Sefer Numbers are actually not foreign to the movement as a whole. However, the Nazirite issue is not raised here, and so I think probably what lies in the background is what I would call the prophetic issue. Part of the motifs of the Gospel according to Luke is the comparison of Jesus and his followers to Elijah and Elisha. the picture of a prophetic form of action and belief, which they associated strongly with the kingdom of God. So this statement of Jesus to a follower, let the dead bury their dead, I think would, in the ears of the people the passage was intended for, have resonated with Elijah's request to Elijah, I will follow you, but let me kiss my father and my mother. And Elijah lets Elijah do that. Is it a way of saying, look, this is an issue more crucial even than that of following Elijah? So I suspect that in this issue of how do you adjudicate principles, a principle that is deeply embedded in the Jesus tradition is that of its consideration of itself as a new movement of prophecy centered on Jesus. That's why he's acclaimed as prophet from time to time. I take those actually to be indications of how, in his own time, Jesus was regarded, so that some of his actions and his teaching are deliberately trenchant in the manner of the prophets. And this, I think, is a very good example of that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think especially this idea of placing all of these teachings in the context of what was most crucial to those who taught suggests that, again, looking at the specifics of what is proclaimed in contrast to others might not be the best way to get at the bottom of things. I'm also struck by the way, in terms of Jesus trying to, because it's certainly something that my students ask a lot. What did people in Jesus' own day think of him? And certainly Messiah was not, at least early in his career, not the first idea.
Right, and he wanted it to be the last. Yeah, that's
right. But you wind up by the end of New Testament times with a Jesus who is a rabbi, as you have pointed out in your biography of Jesus, a prophet, a priest, a son of David, and the Messiah. He ticks every possible box for how one becomes a leader in Judaism. And I think there's no accident that these are the terms in which Jesus is understood. So not as someone who stood outside of, but someone who fulfilled every possible, whatever leader type you're looking for, Jesus fulfills that particular role. And in this case, the prophetic one being so central.
Yep. And in each of those cases, the argument for seeing Jesus that way, is pitched within the New Testament on the basis of the scriptures of Israel. It's how it works out. And in this sense, I think readers of the volume that we've been working on will find the midrashic sections especially interesting because they introduce the way in which the interpretation of Scripture is a major engine of thought within Judaism, which of course is transferred in its own idiom into Christianity. In some cases, I think the importance of this work is not only to find the resonances between rabbinic literature and the New Testament, but also between rabbinic literature and patristic literature. When the fathers make their arguments about Christ, they also are often invoking what they themselves call typologies from the Hebrew Bible to explain who Jesus was, to explain the position of believers in their own time in terms of how Israel is referred to within the Hebrew scriptures as well. This project of interpretation sometimes also involves an intersection of a different kind between rabbinics and patristic literature. Here, too, there has been a very strong tendency to treat these two fields as hermetically sealed from one another, although they developed in the same time periods, and sometimes they developed in the same cities. And there are references within rabbinic literature to debates with philosophers. There are references in patristic literature to arguments with representatives of Judaism. So we have historical evidence for contact, and therefore it becomes a likely field of research to see where these contacts result in echoes from one body of literature into another.
This of course brings to mind, as I'm constantly thinking, that the problem of the definition of the academy, in which classics departments, if it's Latin and Greek, it's classics. If it's Hebrew or Aramaic, it's ancient Near Eastern studies or something different, but we're not classical.
Right.
And the extent to which this prevents the making of connections.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, by the way, just to toot Holy Cross's own horn, is the professor of biblical studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Holy Cross currently holds a joint appointment in the classics department, and our classics department is trying to remedy this age-old limitation on classics, and therefore to be able, presumably in time, to get to exactly the point that you're so correctly making here regarding the many connections in antiquity that
Mm-hmm.
that until books like this one
Yeah.
and other work we're doing just haven't been made.
This doesn't tend to be made. Right. No, that's a very innovative move, and hats off to Holy Cross. That really is wonderful. That's great. Because that could well have a wonderful impact over the long term.
Yeah.
So now I want to ask about Numbers 10:33 and Neophita and John 14:2-3.
Yeah, this is just as the earlier example I gave went back to my reading of the work of Matthew Black. So this example comes from the work of someone whom I think Alan knows, Martin McNamara, who was a major figure in organizing a research project on all the Targumim, seeing to it that they were all the extant Targumim were translated into English for the first time ever as a result of this project, which began in the 1980s. And the energy and precision Martin McNamara brought to that was really quite splendid. Having said that, he and I profoundly disagree about the dating of the Targum I particularly referred to, the Targum Neophiti. It's called Neophiti in Spanish because it was a manuscript discovered in the library of the neophytes in Rome. And it is a complete copy of a Targum to the Pentateuch. It contains a great deal of information about the development of the Aramaic language. But here again, as in the case of Pseudo Jonathan, which I mentioned earlier, it is later than the New Testament by a considerable margin. It is no earlier than the 4th century of the Common Era. And there was a tendency in the early years of investigation to treat it as if it were actually 1st century. One of the editors referred to it as exactly representing the language of Jesus. So Martin McNamara gave the example that in the Gospel according to John, Jesus speaks of going to prepare a place for his disciples. And Martin McNamara observes that in Targum Neophiti, Numbers 10:33, and in other passages in Targumim to the Pentateuch, there are examples, this is on page 88 of the volume, there are examples of the phrase to prepare a dwelling place in Aramaic. And so he said, much as Matthew Black said about Targum Pseudo Jonathan, there you are. Neophiti is providing the phrase and the meaning for the gospel according to John. Where I would suggest, wait, they're actually talking about different things. We have referred to this before, where context is so radically different that to speak of direct borrowing doesn't seem plausible. The issue in John is not preparing a place for Israel in their land, the resting place. The place in the gospel according to John is preparing a place in heaven, explicitly. So what's occurring in this case? I think it is not an instance of direct borrowing, nor is it even like the other where you have a whole proverb, be merciful the way your Father in heaven is merciful. Instead, it's just a phrase. And the gospel according to John has a tendency to absorb words and phrases which came from Aramaic, but then to provide them with new meaning. And we have examples of this. For example, the term rabbi that Alan referred to. You wouldn't necessarily guess this unless you counted the usages, but if you count the usages, you'll see John uses the term rabbi more than any other gospel, although it is the most Hellenistic of all the gospels. John also uses the term amen as an introduction to a sentence, and he doubles it, amen, amen, I say to you. That is, within the particular language of John, there is the ability to absorb Aramaic usages and to make those usages its own. And so I would say that's also the case in this particular instance. So some of the work that we do is not to show that intersection means connection. Sometimes what intersection really means is, oh, look at that. Someone is taking a word or phrase and is developing it with its own particular meaning. And I think we should not be surprised to see this in particular within the Gospel according to John, which, although its Greek style is that of the simplest of poetry, is very adept philosophically at shaping concepts in order to provide its own particular view of who Jesus is.
So the last thing I want to ask about is Isaiah 66:24 and Jonathan Mark 9:47.
Yeah, here we have an intersection which is actually a connection. And here I can actually claim I found it. So this is one of those cases that I'm happy about. And yeah, right. It does occasionally happen that one discovers something new. Like that when it happens. So in this instance, it's the very close of the book of Isaiah in its Aramaic form. And it completes with this picture of punishment of the wicked, such that in the Hebrew text, their worm will not die and their fire will not be quenched. Now, in the Targum, the Aramaic version of Isaiah, that's their breaths will not die and their fire will not be quenched. But the interesting feature of it is that the book of Isaiah in its Aramaic form specifically relates this in a way that the Hebrew text does not to the place called Gehenna. And of course, in Aramaic, it refers to this place as Gehenna, not Gehenom, which would be the Hebrew form. The Aramaic word itself appears in the New Testament, also appears, by the way, in the letter of James in the New Testament. It does not appear frequently, but enough to cause lay readers to stumble on Sunday mornings when they run across it. Of course, we all expect the word hell to be there. Instead, we have the word Gehenna. And that's precisely what's used in the Targum generally, so we can speak of the possibility of the word itself being absorbed within the New Testament, but this particular passage is cited in the Gospel according to Mark. And you have Gehenna present, and you have these fateful words at the close of Isaiah cited. In other words, we have not only the Aramaic term, we also have the Aramaic term associated with exactly the same verse of Isaiah in the Targum that we have in the Gospel according to Mark. Now, as it happens, I won't go into the other cases, but as it happens, the Gospel according to Mark has other instances of this kind of very, what I call, strong intersection, where, yes, we can say the usual things about context, general word usage, sure. But in addition, we can talk about an identity of interpretation. And that's a moment in which I think, as someone engaged with these texts, you have to stand back and you have to pose the question, now, how did this occur? Again, it doesn't mean by itself that Jesus was leafing through the Targum of Isaiah. In his time, the Targum, in my opinion, was not written. There was nothing to leaf. In my opinion, Jesus was illiterate, so he couldn't read in any case. But his ear, it seems to me, quite clearly was familiar with the association of Gehenna with this image of ultimate punishment.
So here's what I want to ask you a lot of that, because that's really interesting. Is it either the Gospels or is it Jesus himself that had some sort of familiarity with that earlier layer?
Oh, I think the answer is yes. That is, I think that there are instances in which it is reasonable to speak of Jesus as an Aramaic speaker and to see his influence on the development of the tradition. But the fact that an influence in Aramaic appears in Aramaic doesn't make it Jesus' influence. I mean, there are plenty of other Aramaic speakers, otherwise, he would not have been using the language. And in fact, in a work that I've been developing recently, I have been identifying what I call different streams of Aramaic tradition within the New Testament. Some coming from, say, Peter, Cephas, could speak Aramaic, James, the brother of Jesus, Barnabas. Uh, these are examples of people who were Aramaic speakers and quite capable not only of relating Jesus' Aramaic teaching, but also of themselves interpreting his Aramaic teaching. After all, Aramaic is a natural medium in this period, a natural medium of interpretation. Clearly, the people who gave a Targum in the synagogue were not simply expected to give a straight rendering of the Hebrew. Allen would have failed them. Allen would not have accepted the kind of lavish interpretation embedded in a translation, which is typical of the Targumim. But in the time, the meaning of the text was clearly felt to be the leading indicator of what the rendering should be, with the result that it becomes, for me, as a reader of the New Testament, not at all surprising that there should be variation among the Gospels. If they come to us in differing streams, and the fact that Matthew says, be perfect, and the fact that Luke has Jesus say, be merciful, is actually not in the least surprising, because all of those materials would have been developed within a worshiping community in which people expected to hear what they would understand. And we also need to bear in mind, in the case of the development of the Gospels, that this is material overall designed for people to hear, not to see. Most of those who became familiar with the Gospels until deep into the Christian period did so by what they heard, not by what they saw. At the beginning, almost none of them could read. Eventually, some could, but not many of them would actually be reading. Most of them were listening to someone else read, even when there were texts. And for a considerable period, there were no texts. Imagine Paul, he writing to the Galatians, tells them that he delivered the triumphant message of the gospel. But he had to do that on the basis of oral tradition. There was no gospel available for him to have in his back pocket. He had no back pocket. There was no gospel that small. And they were not yet being written down as documents. So within an oral culture, it helps us enormously to have recourse to a literature which also grew out of that orality.
So I want to remind everybody that the title of their book is called Targums and the Rabbinic Literature. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you both for joining me today.
Right.
Pleasure. Great to be with you.
Do it. Good to be with you, especially with Alan.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.